Welcome back, everyone, to Healthy Design. Thought today we would talk about something that I am definitely interested in, and that's cholesterol. This seems to kind of cycle in and out of popularity every few years, and I think there's a little more interest now too. And it's something, like I said, I've been interested in for years. So let's talk a little bit about cholesterol. I will go ahead and say up front that I do not think cholesterol or LDL cholesterol or saturated fat plays any role really in heart disease. Um, we'll get to some of the things that support that reasoning later on, but I want to be upfront with people on that. We'll talk a little bit today about the diet heart hypothesis. That's kind of what you hear about in the news and different things, and that states that initially it was that saturated fat led to heart disease, but then research didn't really support that. So then it's changed over time. So then it was LDL cholesterol, and we've seen different things too, where now it's not just the LDL cholesterol, it depends on the particle size. So if they're small and dense, that's a problem. But if they're large and fluffy, it's not a problem. And now it's kind of transitioned to being oxidized LDL. So LDL that's been in the blood is going to get exposed to different things, become oxidized. So now that's why it's dangerous. So in their defense, I've always said when you get research or get something that doesn't support your hypothesis, you have to change it. So at least they have changed their hypothesis some. I just think they keep trying to fit everything around LDL and cholesterol when it doesn't involve LDL and cholesterol. And so I think get rid of those things, start over, have a new hypothesis, and you'd be much better off. And there actually is a different hypothesis. And so we'll talk about that some next time. But let's talk a little bit first about cholesterol, because I don't think most people actually know what it is. They think that you have cholesterol freely floating around in your body. You do not have cholesterol freely floating around in your body. It's not dissolvable in water. Your blood's a liquid, so it's water, so it can't float around in there. If you had free cholesterol floating around, I'm sure it would gunk up things and lead to big problems. But it's not floating around freely in our body. That's where HDL and LDL come from. So HDL is not cholesterol. LDL is not cholesterol. HDL is a high density lipoprotein. So it's a structure that's carrying around cholesterol and fat and other things in our blood. Same thing with a low density lipoprotein. It's a structure that is carrying around that fat, cholesterol, other things in our blood. And LDL is crucial for our health. Without it, we would die. Cholesterol is crucial. Without it, we die. All of our cell membranes have cholesterol. Cells have LDL receptors so that they can get some of the cholesterol and fat and other things from that LDL that they need for them to be healthy. So it does play a role in things, plays a role in hormones and things as well. So, I think there are some people who think that the only way to prevent heart disease or the only way to be healthy is get cholesterol down to zero. That's not the case. So we can already disprove that, because we know if you have zero cholesterol, zero LDL, you will die. So that's not healthy. So I think we can go ahead and kick that out. So again, there's some room for argument for people that are like, well, certain levels of cholesterol and LDL are problematic versus others. We can have that kind of discussion. So that's just a little bit about cholesterol. It's not floating around freely in our blood. You can find cholesterol in plaques. So that's part of where the theory came from. And so the diet heart hypothesis came from Ansel Keys, and his original idea was that saturated fat led to increased cholesterol, which then led to the increase in heart disease we were seeing. When you see cholesterol in a plaque, that makes a lot of sense. If you can find a way to increase cholesterol, and then that could lead to possibly more plaques, which then leads to more heart disease, which, it makes sense from a logical standpoint. And so one of the things he used to, I guess, first start to push this narrative is he did a 7-country study. And so he looked at different countries, US being one of them. And with that, you saw this nice linear line of increased cholesterol or increased saturated fat intake leading to increased heart disease. And that is compelling. There are some issues with that. First, that was not a random controlled trial, it was an observational study. And that's part of the issue, or that's a big issue in nutritional science, is that many things are these observational studies that look at correlation. Again, correlation does not equal causation. I'm not against these studies in full, but I don't think you can use these studies and gain information from them that you then apply to other people and to the world, etc. So I'm not against the studies as a stepping stone in the research process. I am against the use of these studies to make recommendations and say this is what we're supposed to do. And I just want to be clear on that, because I'm sure there's going to be times where I'm citing a study that was an observational study. So they do have some merit. They're just not perfect. Nothing is perfect. But what you need with those studies, like you have this observation, you see this correlation, it needs to be pretty high. Just a 1.1 or 1.2, that's just noise. There's not really any correlation there. But when you start seeing 10 and different things like that, there's probably something there. So we need to start looking further. While we're going down this tangent, because that's the problem with this, I could probably talk for hours because there's all these different rabbit trails and tangents we can go on. Another time or another thing you'll see a lot of times with research is it's in vitro. So it's basically in a little petri dish and you got different cells in there, and there are different ones that have been used for cholesterol and things like this. And that can be good. You can figure out a mechanism of action, but it can be incomplete at the same time, because if you're isolating, like a blood vessel, and in this case, we're just going to use blood vessel and cholesterol. If you isolate those in a petri dish and then just keep loading up cholesterol in there, the way that blood vessel is going to respond to it is going to be different than what it does in the body, because there's all these other mechanisms and stages. The body has a whole bunch of checks and balances to try to keep anything from getting out of whack. So again, we need some of these steps. That's a good thing to have, but we can't just take, oh, this is what we saw in a petri dish, so we know this is exactly what happens in the human body when all the other systems are involved too. No, it's been isolated, try to figure something out. Now we need to see if that plays out in a more complex model and keep going from there. So anyway, that's a little bit on the research side. So that's one problem I have with the 7 country studies. It just looked at 7 countries and observed data and then found a correlation with those. The bigger issue with it is that it was actually a 20 plus country study. And so he didn't use the data from the countries that didn't fit his hypothesis. And that's bad science, plain and simple. Really, when you are doing science, you should come up with a hypothesis and try to disprove it. If you can't disprove it, then that gives evidence for it. And again, in science, you never prove anything. You just keep getting more and more evidence to support something, or you find evidence that contradicts it, and then your hypothesis is wrong and you have to come up with something else. So that's one big issue with it. Again, this was not the only hypothesis that was going on in the 1950s or so. There was a big increase in heart disease. President had a heart attack, so people were very concerned about it. This is just the hypothesis that won out. And part of it was his personality and different things, and he kind of took over things. You can listen to or read Nina Teicholz. She wrote a book, Big Fat Surprise. She talks about a lot of this. And what we saw, or what you can see with this too, is that that hypothesis took over and that became the thing. And so if you had a different hypothesis or spoke out against it, you would lose funding for research, you would lose a job, not be hired somewhere else. So, not the way we normally think of science working, but we see where it just, I don't know, it's more about money and power and different things. And I guess you could say we've seen something like that fairly recently too. I won't get into that, but I think you know what I'm talking about. So, we do see different times, and we've seen it in the past. I'm sure we'll see it in the future, where science is not this pristine and pure thing. It can be just as corrupt as anything else. And that brings me to another point with science. Scientists, or all scientists, do not agree on anything. And so whenever you have any kind of topic that comes up and they're like, oh, all scientists agree on this, it's probably not true. And that's probably not the case, because they tend to, we're human. Scientists are human. And so they're going to have ideas and they're going to believe strongly in those ideas. It's really hard to change people's mind when they believe strongly in something. It can happen, but it doesn't happen easily. So just keep that in mind when you hear different things, especially on the news and stuff. A lot of times you'll get these big headlines, but people don't read what's underneath and read the studies and see what's going on. Because, you know, again, since we're talking about cholesterol, like a lot of the things going on with statins, you just get these big headlines. But what they don't tell you too is that just about all of the research on the statins are from the drug companies. So there's already going to be a bias there. It's going to be hard not to, but so you need to be real careful just taking that at face value. Also, we'll get into this now, because Mark Twain has a quote that there are lies, damn lies, and statistics. And the pharmaceutical companies really love to use statistics to their advantage. There's a commercial now, if I'm not mistaken, I believe it's Repatha. And I bring it up just since it's on the TV right now, people can see it. And on one of the screens, it's talking about like a 27% reduction. And then when you look, so that's huge. 27 just grabs your eyes. That's all you look at. Over on the side, it talks about the actual difference. And so I think, again, I don't remember exactly what it says on there, if this was for heart attack or whatever else, but you had 4.8% of people in the non-treated group have the issue versus 3.6%, I think, in the treated group. So I might have those numbers off a little bit, but it was a 1.2% difference. But that's your absolute difference there. Your absolute risk basically is 1.2% higher if you're not treated with it. But they're saying, basically you get a 27% reduction if you take it. No, you get a 1.2% reduction. So that 1.2 would be absolute risk. That 27 is relative risk. So let's take out any certain medication, but just use this as an example. You have 100 people in the treatment group, 100 people in the placebo group, and you have 2 people in the placebo group that get X. And then you have 1 person in the treatment group that gets X. So you only have a 1% difference there, because it's 100 people, so it's 1% and 2%. So there's only a 1% difference there, but that relative difference between the two is 50%. And so relative risk really doesn't tell us anything. The companies like to use that because it makes it sound like your risk is really high, maybe even 100% risk. And so if you can drop it 30%, 50%, 75%, well, then why wouldn't I want to do that? That just makes perfect sense. And I agree. If it was an absolute risk that high and it dropped it down that low, it would be dumb not to do it. But when your relative risk is like 0.2%, why am I going to, so let's say I have a 0.6% of something and I go down to 0.4. Is that 0.2 really worth any of the possible side effects, negatives? I don't think so. But they could say, well, that's a 33% reduction. Well, yeah, it is a 33% reduction, but my risk is already so small. Does it even matter? So, sorry, that was another tangent. But going back to Ansel Keys. So then what most people don't understand or know is that they actually have done some controlled trials where they did change what people ate and try to see the impact on it. And these trials did not show any difference with heart disease. They didn't show any difference with anything. I mean, so like in one study, they actually got rid of saturated fat and put polyunsaturated fat, and you actually saw like increased cancer rates and different things like that. And maybe I think the mortality rate was actually higher. So overall, all-cause mortality rate was a little bit higher in that polyunsaturated group than it was in the saturated fat group. So there are other studies too that show that, like for LDL cholesterol, you kind of got a sweet spot in the middle where like risk seems to be the lowest, but then at the higher ends, risk does go up. And then at the lower end, the risk does go up. And it's actually a little bit higher in the really, really low group than the really, really high group. It's not a huge difference, but if it was just all about getting it as low as possible and that being better, then that should be down in the middle group, but definitely should be down in the higher group. So that's part of my reason for not thinking LDL goes into that. And we can explain some of those things why even at that higher end the risk goes up some. We again, the body's a complex system. We can't just take one thing out and look at it in isolation. We have to put it all back in. But we'll talk about that next time. So a lot of these studies, like that Minnesota heart experiment, it wasn't published because the findings didn't. Well, I guess I should say, since it seems that the findings didn't go with what they wanted, they just didn't publish it. There were other things that they just were kind of buried in the basement at NIH and not really brought out because it went against that hypothesis. This is not a good thing because a lot of the dietary recommendations we had for years from our government came from some of this. And Nina Teicholz, again, she's talked about these different recommendations, how they haven't been helpful, and it can get a little tricky trying to see because some people will quote that the obesity rates went up steeply right when those recommendations came in. I've heard her say that really some of the recommendations occurred prior to 1980, 81, when the guidelines were made, but there were recommendations before that. So maybe that does help to explain some of it. But if the guidelines came in and things went up steeply that same time, that wasn't enough time for those guidelines to be incorporated into things. So that can't explain everything. Could explain part of it. But one thing we do know is that after those guidelines, people have eaten less meat versus before, but there really isn't much difference in our heart disease risk and the amount. So it hasn't been very effective in stopping things or slowing things down. And so again, I just don't think it's necessarily the right theory or the right hypothesis we should be using. All right, sorry about that little break. Again, I'm trying not to go off on too many tangents, so I just want to check, see kind of what else I want to talk about today. So a couple things, again, to go along with that, why that theory doesn't make sense to me is if you look at the body, we only end up having plaques in our arteries. And we have the same amount of LDL, so the low density lipoproteins, and HDL, high density lipoproteins, floating around in our veins as we do in our arteries. But yet our veins don't get plaques. So if HDL or LDL were necessary or sufficient to create plaques and heart disease, then we should see plaques in the vascular system. So necessary means something has to be present for X disease process to occur, and sufficient has to be in sufficient levels or whatever else for disease to occur. So some things may be necessary for it to occur, and some things may be at a sufficient level for things to occur. So again, people could use that and say that LDL, once it gets to a sufficient amount, it's there. But if it's in a sufficient amount to create issues in the arteries, it's in that same amount in the veins, but it's not creating issues. So that says right there that there's something different, and so there's something else that needs to be there for this to be an issue. You see similar thing like in the pulmonary veins, that you don't have the same level. It's very rare to get a pulmonary hypertension, but you can. So it can occur there, and it can lead, obviously you have some of the plaques. The two different things there, the pulmonary vessels have a whole lot less pressure in them than the arteries, and the veins have even less pressure than the pulmonary. So there seems to be an issue with pressure being involved, and that being something that's required for it. And so again, if the theory is that just the concentration of LDL, once it gets too high, it damages the artery and leads to this issue, then why doesn't it do it through the whole circumference of the artery? Because we got like this cylinder, that's basically what our arteries are, endothelium on the inside and then epithelium on the outside, and we got everything kind of rushing through. So if there's that concentration, it's not just staying on one side, it would be around the whole thing. But we don't see where plaques are going the whole way. They're kind of on one side and protrude into the lumen of the artery. So that doesn't make sense. And then we also tend to see plaques. They occur most commonly when there's a bifurcation, so when the arteries are splitting. And so again, it doesn't make sense. The LDL in and of itself is the thing that's needed for it. And it should also be noted that there are a ton of different risk calculators. So I'm not saying all risk calculators do this, but there are some risk calculators that do not include LDL or cholesterol in them when they're determining risk. And one of the highest risk factors for having coronary artery disease or heart disease is smoking. Not everybody who smokes is going to have high cholesterol. And if it's a risk factor in and of itself, what does it have to do with cholesterol? So again, I'm just saying that pokes holes in the theory that it's all about cholesterol, all about LDL. And I think that's one of the bigger issues we see is that they went looking for a cause, for the cause, basically for heart disease. And so now if you look it up, I mean, there's hundreds, thousands of different risk factors that increase your risk for heart disease. And again, not all of those are LDL or HDL or cholesterol or saturated fat. It's smoking, diabetes, different things like that all lead to this. So just to kind of give you a hint for what's coming next time, the other theory, it's been called different things, but basically it's the thrombogenic theory for heart disease. And what it states is that there's an injury that has to occur first. And so we'll kind of discuss that and kind of correlate or tie in how LDL does play a role in things. But I would say the part of the reason we're seeing cholesterol in those plaques is because LDL and other things are actually doing their job to fix things and make things better. They're not creating the issues in the first place. So next time we'll go a little bit into the science kind of behind how injury healing occurs, and we'll just discuss everything then. This way you get information. You can make up your own mind on what you think is best for you. Again, none of this should be considered medical advice. I'm just providing information. This is all for educational purposes. I want people to have all the information they need so that they can make the best decision for themselves. That's what informed consent is. If you're not giving, but just part of things, you can't truly make an informed decision. So that's what we'll try to do next time, give you even more information so you can make the best choice. Hope you guys have a great one. I'll see you next time. Bye.